Hello, students. We're going to discuss some dreamers of the golden dream. I've really appreciated the conversations happening in the discussion. Next week, you'll be sharing your research topics, so hopefully we could get that started at the beginning of the week so you can get some feedback on your topics. I'm hoping that your topics will be things you're interested in. Don't feel the need to choose typical academic topics. As Graff argues in Hidden Intellectualism, any topics can be valid if you approach them from an academic point of view. The reading this week, Some Dreamers of the Golden Dream. I attached a PDF here for you. I scanned it and printed it out myself. Here's the book. It's pretty classic 70s California. Joan Didion is a great writer, and she's known for her style. People describe her style as Hemingway-esque. She has a great, clear, forward, direct approach to her writing. And I thought that this essay was a good example of how you can use a topic that is not necessarily about literature to do something academic. And it's a beautifully written essay about a murder case. And it's also about California culture and how California serves as a magnet for people from other parts of the country who come to try and live out some version of a dream that they may have. And yet the realities of California can be much more stark, bleak, and in cases like this essay, grim. On page 4, she writes, "The future always looks good in the Golden Land because no one remembers the past." And I thought that this was an interesting quote because it reminds me that something we experience a lot in digital culture, where there's this tremendous sense of presentism, where what's happening now is what matters most, and the past is irrelevant. This ethos was already prevalent in California, as California used to be the center, one of the centers of the culture industry. In fact, Adorno wrote a book called The Culture Industry about Southern California, a collection of essays. Definitely worth checking out. But Didion writes about that culture and the disillusionment is the key term that I think characterizes what she's describing when she looks at certain lives and how they stumble in pursuit of their dreams. In this case, she's following the murder trial of Lucille Marie Maxwell Miller. And what starts out as a accident with a vehicle that is on fire turns out to be a murder case. Again, on page 4, Didion writes, Here is where they are trying to find a new lifestyle, trying to find it in the only place they know how to look, the movies and the newspapers. Again, emphasizing the importance of culture in the life choices of the people she's writing about. And while she's writing about Miller, Miller stands in for a sector of the culture. Another aspect that Didion does so well in this essay is her description of place. On page 5, she writes, "Imagine Banyan Street first, because Banyan is where it happened. The way to Banyan is to drive west from San Bernardino out Foothill Boulevard, Route 66, past the Santa Fe switching yards, the 40 Winks Motel, past the motel that is 19 stucco teepees, sleep in a wigwam, get more for your wampum, past Fontana Drag City and the Fontana Church of the Nazarene and the Pit Stop A-Go-Go, past Kaiser Steel, through Cucamonga, out to the Kapukai Restaurant Bar and Coffee Shop at the corner of Route 66 and Carnelian Avenue, up Carnelian Avenue from the Kapukai, which means Forbidden Seas. The subdivision flags whip in the harsh wind. Half-acre ranches, snack bars, travertine entrees, $95 down. It is the trail of an intention gone haywire, the flotsam of the new California." And I thought that this geographic description, this map that she traces, gives it a vivid sense of place, and her description of place mirrors the desolation of the lives of the characters she profiles. A little further down, she writes, or actually, let's just continue. "But after a while, the signs thin out on Carnelian Avenue, and the houses are no longer the bright pastels of the springtime homeowners, but the faded bungalows of the people who grow a few grapes and keep a few chickens out here. And then the hill gets steeper, and the road climbs, and even the bungalows are few. And here, desolate, roughly surfaced, lined with eucalyptus and lemon groves, is Banyan Street." And so there's this kind of an epic journey to get to this location where the murder happens. And as she traces this path out of the centers of culture into kind of the hinterlands of California, the desolation intensifies. She writes, "Like so much of this country, Banyan suggests something curious and unnatural. The lemon groves are sunken down a 3 or 4 foot retaining wall so that one looks directly into their dense foliage. Too lush, unsettlingly glossy, the greenery of nightmare. The fallen eucalyptus bark is too dusty, a place for snakes to breed." So she's using the landscape to describe a mood of a story and the tone of the story. This is kind of a gritty realism, which doesn't fit our expectations when we read the title of the essay, "Some Dreamers of the Golden Dream." On the next page, "Banyan Street was the route Lucille Miller took home from the 24-hour Mayfair market on the night of October 7th, 1964, a night when the moon was dark and the wind was blowing and she was out of milk, and Banyan Street was where, at about 12:30 a.m., her 1964 Volkswagen came to a sudden stop, caught fire, and began to burn." So this is where we learn about the incident that becomes the source of the mystery. And this story, this essay, is part of a genre familiar to many of you, I would suppose, which is true crime. And this is a kind of expository essay because she's taking things that she's found in the media and as a journalist herself, investigating this story. But by the time she is investigating, the story is already concluded, but she is presenting it as emblematic of a type of Californian. She writes on page 7, of course she came from somewhere else, came off the prairie in search of something she had seen in a movie or heard on the radio, for this is a Southern California story. Again, emphasizing how the myth of California, the golden dream of California, is what brings people who maybe are only going to be disappointed by the realities of the place. And then treating this story almost like a short story, Didion goes through some of the origin story of Lucille Miller and then her marriage, and kind of infers from the moves that they make that Lucille Miller's husband, who ends up dying in that car wreck, was a bit of a depressive and possibly was, if not coerced, manipulated, influenced into moving into this spot in California from Oregon, where he went to school, where they met. But as their marriage seems to be in decline, on page 9, she writes, it might have been anyone's bad summer, anyone's siege of heat and nerves and migraine and money worries, but this one began particularly early and particularly badly. On April 24th, an old friend, Elaine Hayton, died suddenly. Lucille Miller had seen her only the night before. This is a moment of foreshadowing because, as we'll find out, Elaine Hayton is the wife of her lover. She's having an affair. And although Elaine Hayton's death is never fully investigated, she's thought to have died from an allergy to hairspray. But the real reason she's not investigated is because she's married to an attorney, and there's too much potential heat in investigating her. During the month of May, Cork Miller was hospitalized briefly with a bleeding ulcer, and his usual reserve deepened into depression. Cork Miller being Lucille Miller's husband. He told his accountant that he was sick of looking at open mouths and threatened suicide. By July 8th, the conventional tensions of love and money had reached the conventional impasse in the new house on the acre lot at 8488 Bella Vista, and Lucille Miller filed for divorce. Within a month, however, the Millers seemed reconciled. They saw a marriage counselor. They talked about a fourth child. It seemed that the marriage had reached the traditional truce, the point at which so many resigned themselves to cutting both their losses and their hopes. And so far in this essay, Lucille Miller has been shown to be a woman who had a certain amount of ambition, but here she is in a process of seemingly giving up. However, shortly after, there is the car accident. And because there are some details about the accident that don't add up. There's an investigation, and Lucille Miller is accused of murder. Let's see. One of those details is that on page 13, it seemed curious to the detectives too that a sudden stop from 35 miles per hour, the same jolt which was presumed to have knocked over a gasoline can in the back seat and somehow started the fire, should have left 2 milk cartons upright on the back floorboard and the remains of a Polaroid camera box lying apparently undisturbed on the back seat. So as they continue to investigate the scene, they realize it's not all adding up, and they come to conclude that actually Lucille Miller had killed her husband. On page 16, in some ways it was the conventional clandestine affair in a place like San Bernardino, a place where little is bright or graceful, where it is routine to misplace the future and easy to start looking for it in a bed. So even though there's this sense that the past doesn't exist, there's also this idea that at a certain point, the dreams that people have for the future might become no longer viable, and that certain forms of vice, such as affairs, can take the place of the dream. On page 17, it was in the breakup that the affair ceased to be in conventional mode and began to resemble instead the novels of James M. Cain, the movies of the late 1930s, all the dreams in which violence and threats and blackmail are made to seem commonplaces of middle-class life. What was most startling about the case that the state of California was preparing against Lucille Miller was something that had nothing to do with law at all. Something that never appeared in the 8-column afternoon headlines, but was always there between them, the revelation that the dream was teaching the dreamers how to live. Here is Lucille Miller talking to her lover sometime in the early summer of 1964, after he had indicated that on the advice of his minister he did not intend to see her anymore. First, I'm going to go to that dear pastor of yours and tell him a few things. When I do tell him that, you won't be in the Redlands church anymore. Look, sonny boy, if you think your reputation is going to be ruined, your life won't be worth 2 cents. And so they go back and forth, and it's actually in their arguments that their relationship elevates into a kind of drama. And they start to spy on each other and try to get information on each other that they can use as blackmail. Things start to get pretty seedy. And then we go to the trial. And it's in the trial that Hayton has his most brutal refutation of their affair or their love when he's asked, "Would you deny that you were having an affair with Mrs. Miller?" a reporter had asked. He says, "I would deny that there was any romance on my part whatsoever." And so it becomes a famous case as people start to flood the courthouse, and then it's found out that Lucille Miller is pregnant. And there's some confusion as to why she would murder him. There's the double indemnity of his insurance bond. But part of what causes Lucille Miller to become convicted is her attitude in court. She talks a lot. She talks too much. On page 23, when the sergeant asked why she had agreed to talk to him against the specific instructions of her lawyers, Lucille Miller said airily, "Oh, I've always been basically quite an honest person. I mean, I can put a hat in the cupboard and say it costs $10 less, but basically I've always kind of just lived my life the way I wanted to, and if you didn't like it, you could take off." Then there's their babysitter, Sandy Slagle, who believes in Lucille Miller and is distraught at the verdict being guilty. And there's also her daughter, who's 14 at the time, on page 24. There was Debbie, the Miller's 14-year-old, testifying in a steady voice about how she and her mother had gone to a supermarket to buy the gasoline can the week before the accident. Further down, they brought in the verdict, guilty of murder in the first degree at 4:50 p.m. on March 5th. "She didn't do it," Debbie Miller cried, jumping up from the spectator section. "She didn't do it." At the time of this writing, Lucille Miller was still in prison, and so Didion concludes the essay by describing the place where she currently resides. On page 25, she writes, "The California Institution for Women at Frontera, where Lucille Miller is now, lies down where Euclid Avenue turns into Country Road, not too many miles from where she once lived and shopped and organized the Heart Fund Ball. Cattle graze across the road, and rainbirds sprinkle the alfalfa. Frontera has a softball field and tennis courts, and looks as if it might be a California junior college, except that the trees are not yet high enough to conceal the concertina wire around the top of the cyclone fence." And so Didion's essay shows this strange connection between crime and dreaming in the California context, and the disillusionment of people who have moved to California in pursuit of their dreams, only to find that they are very much out of reach. And I also included this article written by Deborah Miller for the Los Angeles Times, and this was written in 2022. And Deborah Miller is that 14-year-old girl who testified about the gas can and cried out she didn't do it. This is the image of the Volkswagen. And Miller writes a very interesting personal narrative about how this essay affected her life and how she had lived for much of her life denying the truth of the essay. She writes, "Didion's essay is not sympathetic, but it helped make her famous, and rightfully so. She was able, by focusing on my mother, to rip apart the tissue of lies that California newcomers tell themselves about how life will be better, different, happier here." She recounts, "My mother hated Didion's essay and taught her children to hate it too. She believed it was Didion's revenge on her for turning down an interview request. Whether it was or not, I think my mother made a huge mistake refusing to talk to Didion." She recalls the moment that's recorded in Didion's essay. She says, "At the time she was convicted, I deeply believed in my mother's innocence. As Didion wrote about me, she didn't do it." Debbie Miller cried, jumping up from the spectator section. "She didn't do it." But she continues, "Now I'm not so sure. I think I need my mother to be guilty because she suffers so much, and no innocent person should pay such a price. I believe her infidelities doomed her. She was also stoic during her trial, hardly seeming like a grieving pregnant widow. The lines of her mouth turned down, making her look cold." And then she recounts what happens to their lives after her mother, after the essay, after her mother's in prison, out of prison. And then she goes on to teach English and has this sort of crisis when she realizes that people are going to be teaching the essay and they might realize that it was her. However, she ends up going to an event where she meets Joan Didion. First, she writes Joan Didion, and Didion responds. And Didion has this interesting moment where she talks about being a writer. She says, "Dear Deborah Miller, I've begun this letter so many times because there's no real way to tell you how moved I am by your letter. As a writer, I tend to compartmentalize the people and events I've written about. The writer goes in, tries to understand the story as if the act of writing it down completed the situation, became the truth. I guess I think writers need to do this, have to do this to maintain the nerve to write anything at all. But of course, it's an illusion." And that was a very interesting admission of her role in writing something that sort of decisively paints Lucille Miller as guilty when, of course, there's plenty of evidence that suggests she had done it, but there's no definitive way to know one way or the other. And then she gets to meet Didion, and it changes her mind about the essay. She ends the essay by saying, "Sometime after that, I gave my colleagues permission to use the essay in their classes. I also gave them permission to tell their students that Miss Miller was Debbie, the 15-year-old who cried out for her mother when the judge read the guilty verdict. I told my story to each junior English class, inviting students to ask me anything they wanted. It was intimidating to them, but it was rewarding for me." And it changes her attitude about being the subject of a Joan Didion essay. And I thought it was an interesting extension of the essay that we read by Didion to see someone she wrote about actually responding to her. So I hope you could see this is an interesting example of an expository essay that takes kind of a non-traditional subject, a true crime story, and treats it in a way that makes the details of the event more than simply the reporting of a crime story, but it becomes about a larger narrative of California itself. And I hope you enjoyed it and maybe got a little bit inspired in the writing of your own expository essays. You don't have a tremendous amount of time for each of your deadlines, but I think that you are definitely capable of finding some interesting material when you research your topics and putting it together with some good writing that will make it compelling for your readers. All right, happy writing. I'll see you soon.